Hello, reading friend, and thanks for joining me for another book chat. Today, let's spend some time with the future of nutrition. An insider's look at the science, why we keep getting it wrong, and how to start getting it right by Colin Campbell with co-author Nelson Disla. So, The Future of Nutrition by Colin Campbell, PhD. This book was originally published in 2020, and I decided to read this because I read several years ago another book by Colin Campbell called Whole, which also concerned nutrition, and I just thought that was so fascinating, and it really changed my perspective of food and nutrition. So when I heard that he had a new book out, I definitely wanted to pick this up. Colin Campbell is a very noted academic of nutrition and has had a long career in academia for nutrition at Cornell. And also, he's been on government panels and things like that. So he's been at sort of the highest levels of academic and institutional sort of nutrition. So I think he definitely has a sort of authoritative voice in this field. So I take what he says, fairly seriously. So I did enjoy this. So this book really, what it's about, it pertains to really answering three different questions. They're here in the jacket. It says, the first one is, why the institutional emphasis on individual nutrients instead of whole foods as a means to explain nutrition has had catastrophic consequences. And I'm going to talk about each of these more here in a bit. Second main point is why mainstream food and nutrient recommendations and public policy favor corporate interests over that of personal and planetary health. And then the third point here is how we can ensure that public nutrition literacy can prevent and treat personal illness more effectively and economically. So yeah, just to sort of touch base on each of these points, I want to start with this idea of whole foods that he mentions here in the first point. Why the institutional emphasis on individual nutrients as opposed to whole foods as a means to explain nutrition has had catastrophic consequences. So, if you buy some food that's packaged in a market, at least here in the U.S., it will list the nutritional ingredients, right? But it only lists the specific ones. So that is a very, very small portion of the actual nutrition in any given object. Even if you take something like an apple, there are literally thousands of chain reactions that happen in your body when you eat an apple because it has hundreds of components that aren't listed on any sort of nutrition guide that you might see. And the nutrition of an apple, the complicated, really complicated nutritional pathways of when you eat an apple change depending on what you eat the apple with, or what kind of apple, or how the apple was grown, or when it was picked. They're variable, so it's variable. So there is no definite component of an apple as if you were assembling a machine. And so I think this is the point that he's making here, is that we have this sort of mechanistic view of nutrition that sort of filters down from our general scientific worldview that predominates our current sort of thinking and our current paradigm, this reductionist idea of like just reduce an item to its smallest parts and then you have its components as if it were a machine, and then you could just reassemble it. That's not the case with food, because food is far more complicated than that. So he talks about how this sort of came to be, because it wasn't always so. So early in like the 19th century, even there were studies being done about whole food, really whole food and plant-based diets and how they impact nutrition, all the way back into ancient Greece with Hippocrates. Hippocrates is known for having said, "Let food be thy medicine, and medicine be thy food." I think the medical profession has gotten away from this because the medical profession really got consumed by this reductionism that was in the overall sort of paradigm, this sort of scientific paradigm that we live under. So if it can't be tested in this sort of reductionist way that the current science looks at, then it's not considered real. It's not considered true because it's not considered scientific if it can't be broken down into its component parts like this. And this has caused something like cancer treatment. He goes into quite a bit of detail here around cancer treatment and how cancer treatments early in the 19th century and throughout the 19th century, even up until the earlier part of the 20th century, as surgery was gaining ground with the advent of x-rays and surgical techniques were improving, surgery became almost the only method of treating cancer at that point. Then they started to develop these sort of cytotoxic cancer drugs, chemotherapy drugs that were brought into play as well. But surgery for many cancers is still the main source of treatment, and they don't look at anything else. And so he goes into quite a bit of detail about how all this came to be and how it changed the institutions, the medical institutions. Like, for example, the American Cancer Society had one of its earliest founders actually studied nutrition because he was really interested in the uneven distribution of cancer rates. So in the U.S., this idea that we have now, because we live kind of in this genetic paradigm now, where we think, oh, cancer is genetic, so if you have this certain gene, then you're going to get this kind of cancer. And that may or may not be the case because the gene would actually have to be activated somehow, right? And you can maybe do different types of measures to keep it from being activated. But okay, back in the 19th century, this guy, his name was Hoffman. He was one of the founders of the American Cancer Society. But he was really curious about this. The other thing is that cancer is just not distributed evenly across humanity, right? So there's different rates of certain kinds of cancers, for example, in China as opposed to here, or Africa as opposed to here. So Africans, when they are in Africa, have a certain type of cancer and heart disease profile, but when they move to the U.S., within a generation or so, they have then adapted to the American rates, the African American rates. Same things for like immigrants from like China that would have a certain cancer and heart disease, much less than the standard American one in China. But then if they move here, then they would actually, after a certain period of time, because they adopt our lifestyle, right? They adopt our diet. As part of that, they will develop the same, and not just Chinese, but any immigrants. When they move here to the U.S., they eventually adapt to and then start reflecting our rates of cancer and heart disease. So I think that is really interesting, and it was brought up to the American Cancer Society. They since really discounted that, and now they certainly went to this sort of reductionist mode, which they're still in. He spends a lot of time in the book talking about the impact on institutions of this and how devastating that's been, because then he also goes into, like, for example, research money. So the research money follows a lot of times industry. So the food industry, the agricultural industry, particularly the animal agricultural industry, because Colin Campbell here is advocating here for a whole food, plant-based diet. Whole food, like I mentioned, plant-based diet. So no animal products, no animal proteins. He talks here about malnutrition as a typical American. Americans right now, we live in the highest affluence that we've ever had, actually, and we've had the highest affluence actually in the entire history of humanity. And so humanity adapted itself, especially in a dietary pattern, to a system of scarcity. But now we live in a system of abundance, meaning we can overeat. So malnutrition, it just means bad eating. We think of malnutrition as not getting enough to eat because we still think in scarcity, but we live in abundance. So malnutrition is eating too much of the wrong things. So he talks about that here, and I thought that was really interesting. And then another point was made about overnutrition. This is overeating things. Like, one thing he talks about quite a bit here is animal protein. We have this myth that you have to eat animal protein or you're going to be unhealthy. And, I'm a vegan. I've only recently adopted the more whole food plant-based diet, but I've been a vegan since 2013. And so when people often ask me, like, well, where do you get your protein? And I go, I don't know. I guess I should be dead because I haven't had any animal protein since 2013. Or maybe I should be in the hospital with some sort of protein deficiency. But obviously, I don't have a protein deficiency, and I'm doing fine without animal protein. But we have this myth in our culture here in the U.S. anyway that you got to overeat protein, and overeating animal protein particularly can be a trigger for cancer and for many other sorts of diseases that plague modern affluent American society, like heart disease and Alzheimer's disease. One thing I wanted to mention around that sort of was how culture influences dietary choices, and also how confusing it all is. And this has kind of been on purpose. So the dietary recommendations by the government are heavily influenced by agricultural industry, particularly the animal agricultural industry, because of course they want you to think that you need to consume animal protein like dairy or animal flesh every day, multiple times a day, in order to stay healthy, because of course they want you to continue to consume it. Same thing with eggs and things like that. So the dietary recommendations are heavily influenced by industry. He gives particular examples in the book of where this has been the case. He's participated in government panels. He's worked with the National Cancer Institute, so he's seen all of this sort of firsthand. He's also experienced this funding issue that I mentioned previously from his university at Cornell that gets money, from the dairy industry. And so the universities don't want to scare away these potential donors with these other kinds of studies like nutrition studies that would conflict with something like dairy consumption. So, in other words, who ends up suffering is the American public, because we get conflicting information, we get confusing information, we don't get consistent information from any of our trusted institutions, and he makes a call to change that. And, he feels like, I think that we as consumers and we as citizens, unless we demand this sort of change and this sort of transparency, we're not going to get it, because the institutions themselves are really resistant to this kind of change. It's the nature of institutionalized academia like this, that it's very resistant to change once it becomes entrenched. And so it's going to be a very difficult problem to overcome. But the point he makes is that if we're interested in leading the healthiest, best life that we can for ourselves, we need to educate ourselves on whole foods, the benefit of eating whole foods and plant-based diets, and really going out there and learning as much as you can about that, and then just living it, I found this really interesting, so I'm so glad that I went ahead and got this read. I have another book on nutrition that's in my queue I hope to get to at some point later this year. All right, I will stop this chat here. My next chat is going to be, let me just call it up. It's going to be The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. This is a medieval, monastic, multiple murder mystery. The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco. I have finished this already, so I should have a chat on it coming up fairly soon. Until next time, take care. Bye.